Thank you. It's very good to see you all. So there's my first slide. So what I'm going to talk to you today is about the rule of law. So let me just tell you how I became interested in the rule of law. As was mentioned, I spent about 15 years thinking and writing and researching intellectual property rights in various ways. And about 3 or 4 years ago, I found myself in a workshop on traditional knowledge, with two groups in that workshop. One group of people saying that the exploitation of traditional knowledge was an outrage and it needed to be stopped in all sorts of ways. Another group of people saying the only hope for traditional knowledge was for it to be exploited because then it would be reproduced. And what was interesting about both these groups was, despite they had completely conflicting political positions, they both agreed that their positions would be furthered by the introduction of various legal mechanisms. In other words, they believed in the rule of law. So that was their sort of central belief. So let me first of all just check. Are there any anarchists in the room? Anybody here is an anarchist? Excellent. Okay, well in that case, I'd just like you to spend a couple of seconds thinking to yourself, if you were asked in the pub to defend the proposition the rule of law is a bad thing, how would you go about that? Can you do it? Can you immediately come up with an idea about why the rule of law is not welcome, is not something that we should use to manage our lives? Just give yourself a couple of seconds, think carefully. Given that none of you are anarchists, I'm going to assume that most of you will have found that proposition actually quite difficult. Now, what's interesting about the proposition that the rule of law is a good thing is that it is widely shared around the world. Here are 4 leaders who've all recently said something in the way of supporting the rule of law. You'll notice I haven't included Donald Trump. And I think your laughter indicates why I might not have done. Mostly across the rulers of our world, the governments, the government leaders, the notion of the rule of law is taken as being a common sense. It's something that is just regarded as being sensible. It's something that we should all agree with. Now, just to give you a suggestion about why that's actually quite widespread, I don't know how many of you saw the trailer for Frost Nixon some years ago. It's a film about the interaction, the engagement between David Frost and President Nixon quite late on in his presidential career, around the time that Watergate was happening. And in that trailer, there's a series of discussions between Frost and Nixon. And at one point, as the trailer sort of gets to the end, reaches its peak, as it were, Frost asks Nixon something, and Nixon's response is, and I'll just have to read this, I've written it down, when the president does it, that means it's not illegal. And the way it's presented, and again the same because some people are already laughing, the way it's presented is to say that's actually shocking. And the reason it's shocking is because we all know that the rule of law is preferable to the rule of men. And when I say the rule of men, what I mean is the rule of men and force. The rule of law indicates something about legitimacy, it relates something about social justification. The rule of men is about violence, oppression and force. And so what we see when we think about that term, the rule of law, is a rejection of what we might call arbitrary government, the government of individuals with their own interests, again, the positive exception of Donald Trump. When we think about that, that's how we understand how society works. And so, to try and put a bit of flesh on that, what I'm going to suggest to you is actually one of the reasons that we think that is because we can have lots of different views about the rule of law, but we can actually keep them all in mind at the same time, or we can have conversations where it's not necessarily obvious we're talking about different things. And the reason for that is I like to think of the rule of law along a continuum, and at one end, right at one end here, we have the thin rule of law, and right at this other end we have the thick rule of law. And there's a continuum, a line, along which we could perhaps allocate particular places for any particular opinion about the rule of law. Now, right at that thinnest end, that's where you're going to have things like apartheid, you're going to have things like the Third Reich, and these are areas where the law is still enacted, but the outcomes are not really what we regard as just or fair. So, in Nazi regimes, in apartheid regimes, certain members of the population were treated in a way that we would not regard as being strictly justified or perhaps fair or even pleasant. So from that point of view, that's very thin. That's about procedure. You could have legal procedures, but somehow they don't have the sort of content that we might want them to have. Right at the other end, We can move along that line by stuffing more and more into the rule of law, and right at the other end, we have the sort of idea of the rule of law that sees it as being coterminous with, or collecting with, ideas around international human rights, the notions of justice, the notions of fairness. And what we've done in that move from thin to thick is we've introduced all sorts of normative elements around morality and ethics. So the rule of law, when we talk about the rule of law, we can be two people talking about it, one of whom thinks actually it's really just about procedure, and another person thinks it's really about international human rights. But the joy of the joy of the rule of law as a way of thinking enables all of those people to talk together. Now, actually, I think the real thing that is at the centre of this is a desire to see justice, to see fairness. And when we start thinking about the rule of law, one of the things that often becomes clear to us when we're trying to decide, is this something that really is the rule of law against something that perhaps isn't, is whether we think it is just. And I want to finish just by reminding you, if you know this already, but if you don't, introduce you to somebody. This is a historian, a well-known Marxist historian called E.P. Thompson. And E.P. Thompson spent a lot of time thinking about the law in the 18th century. He wrote a fabulous book called Whigs and Hunters. And in Whigs and Hunters, what Thompson does is he looks at the way the ruling class in 18th century Britain ran the legal system. And of course, what he talks about is what were then called the Black Acts. And the Black Acts were all about hanging, essentially, people who stole sheep, hanging people who, in some way, stole things that belonged to the rich and the wealthy. But what Thompson concluded was, even though the law was being used in that way, because it was pretending, or at least trying to be, the rule of law rather than the rule of men, at any time it had to deliver something that looked like justice. And because it had to deliver something to look like justice so people would actually regard it as legitimate and follow the law without being forced to, that meant that actually, for some of the time, it delivered the very justice that it was pretending to deliver. So what Thompson concluded was actually, even when the law looks like procedural law, the very act of getting people to follow the law voluntarily means at some point it must produce justice. And by doing so, even if that justice is incomplete or partial, the rule of law remains an unqualified human good. And I leave you with that thought. Anytime somebody says to you, oh, I'm not so interested in the law, I'm not so interested in people following it, you should dismiss that. The rule of law is always a good thing. It may be variable, it may be employed in different ways, but just to come back to Donald Trump, what is the most interesting thing about American politics at the moment is both at the same time that Trump is trying to reject the rule of law in many ways, actually it is acting to keep him under control. It is undoubtedly an unqualified human good. Thank you very much.